What if the greatest civilization in human history was deliberately erased from our collective memory? What if the magnificent buildings we walk past every day were not built by those who now claim them as their own creations? In 1357, a manuscript was created that would challenge everything we think we know about our past, our architecture, and our true technological heritage. Its pages describe a world that officially never existed, yet evidence of it surrounds us everywhere. Tonight, we examine a document that powerful forces have tried to suppress for over 6 centuries. A manuscript that proves the erasure was intentional, systematic, and devastatingly effective, yet somehow incomplete. The document describes a global empire spanning every continent, unified not by conquest alone, but by shared architecture, advanced technology, and knowledge that, we are told, humanity did not possess until very recent centuries. It names cities that appear on no modern map, yet match archaeological sites we are forbidden to properly investigate. It describes energy systems we are told were never invented, yet the infrastructure for them still stands in plain sight. It documents a catastrophe that official history refuses to acknowledge. An event so devastating that it buried entire civilizations under meters of mud and debris, leaving only the upper floors of their grandest buildings visible to survivors. This is not speculation based on vague interpretations. This is not wishful thinking from alternative historians. This is what the manuscript actually says, preserved despite centuries of coordinated effort to destroy every copy that ever existed. The question that haunts every page of this document is simple but devastating. Why would anyone want to erase an entire civilization from human memory? What knowledge did they possess that had to be suppressed at any cost? The answer may reshape everything you believe about history, about the buildings in your own city, about the true capabilities of humanity before the great forgetting began, and a new narrative was imposed upon the survivors. We will examine the manuscript's claims systematically, comparing them to physical evidence that still exists in cities around the world. We will let you decide what the truth might be when all the evidence is finally assembled. The manuscript surfaced in the collection of a European monastery during a routine cataloging project, filed among documents considered too heretical for public discussion, protected by its own obscurity for generation after generation of silent monks. For centuries it gathered dust in climate-controlled vaults, its contents known only to a handful of scholars who understood the implications of what they were reading and chose to remain silent rather than face the consequences of disclosure. When digitization projects began scanning monastery archives in the early 2000s, the manuscript was photographed page by page and uploaded to academic servers, briefly accessible to anyone with research credentials, before someone recognized what it actually contained. Within weeks of its digital publication, copies were removed from public servers without explanation. The original was transferred to a restricted archive in an undisclosed location. Access was denied to every researcher who requested examination. But the suppression came too late. Copies had already spread to private servers across multiple continents. Scholars had already downloaded the high-resolution images. The manuscript had escaped into the world once more, and this time it would not be contained. What did this medieval document contain that triggered such rapid and coordinated response from institutions that normally move with glacial slowness? What secrets demanded such immediate concealment from public awareness and academic scrutiny? The answer lies in what the manuscript describes with precise detail and geographic specificity. A world unified under what it calls the Great Tartary, an empire that was not confined to Central Asia, but extended across every landmass on Earth. This was not described as a primitive tribal confederation of nomadic horsemen, the image we are given in modern textbooks. This was an advanced civilization with technologies we are told did not exist until the 19th or 20th centuries. The manuscript describes buildings that generated their own power through atmospheric energy collection. It describes communication systems that operated instantaneously without wires across vast distances. It documents transportation networks spanning entire continents. Most critically, it describes these not as magic or divine miracle, but as engineering, as applied knowledge that the civilization had developed over millennia and deployed on a global scale for purposes we are only beginning to understand. Perhaps most disturbingly, the manuscript describes a coming catastrophe with chilling precision, an event that would bury this civilization under waves of mud and water, leaving only fragments to confuse future generations about what had truly existed before. The author writes as someone who knows the end is approaching, who is creating a record for those who will come after, who hopes that someday the truth will surface again, even if centuries must pass before humanity is ready to receive it. This prophetic quality of the manuscript has led some to dismiss it as apocalyptic fantasy, the fever dreams of a medieval mind obsessed with end times. But the physical evidence suggests the author may have known exactly what was coming. Buildings around the world show evidence of burial and excavation that matches the manuscript's predictions precisely. First floors became basements. Ground-level entrances were buried under meters of debris. Windows that once overlooked streets now peer into soil. The manuscript provides dates, locations, and sequences for these events that align with gaps in the historical record, periods when entire cities seem to have been abandoned, repopulated, and renamed by people with no memory of who built them originally. We are told these gaps represent natural transitions, gradual changes in population and culture. The manuscript says otherwise. It describes a deliberate reset, a coordinated rewriting of history by those who inherited structures they did not build and could not replicate. For the next 2 hours, we will examine the evidence systematically, beginning with the manuscript's descriptions of the Tartarian world, then examining the physical traces that survive, and finally, considering what this might mean for our understanding of the past. What you are about to see will challenge fundamental assumptions about human history that have been reinforced through education, media, and institutional authority for generations. The discomfort you may feel is the sensation of foundational beliefs beginning to shift. We do not ask you to believe anything. We ask only that you examine the evidence with open eyes and consider the possibility that the history we were taught was not merely incomplete, but deliberately falsified to serve purposes we are only now beginning to understand. The 1357 manuscript waited 6 centuries for this moment. Its author believed the truth would eventually surface. Perhaps that time has finally arrived. Perhaps you are meant to be among those who finally see what was hidden in plain sight all along. Before we proceed, understand the framework through which we will analyze this evidence. We are not claiming absolute proof of any particular interpretation. We are presenting documented anomalies that demand explanation and have never received satisfactory answers. The official historical narrative has gaps large enough to drive entire civilizations through. The manuscript offers one possible explanation for those gaps. Whether you accept that explanation is entirely your decision to make. What we can say with certainty is that the manuscript exists, that its claims are specific and testable, and that physical evidence around the world corresponds to its descriptions in ways that coincidence cannot adequately explain. We can also say with certainty that this information has been suppressed, that researchers who pursue these questions face professional consequences, and that institutions guard certain historical narratives with an intensity that suggests something more than academic disagreement. The question of why this suppression occurs is perhaps more important than any specific claim about the past. What is being protected? Who benefits from the official narrative? What would change if the manuscript's account were widely accepted as possible? Act 1. The map that shouldn't exist. The manuscript contains something that should be impossible. Detailed descriptions of cities and infrastructure that match locations around the world, written centuries before Europeans supposedly discovered them. The author describes the world, not as medieval Europeans understood it, with vast, unknown regions filled with monsters and speculation, but as someone who had access to comprehensive geographic knowledge spanning every continent and major landmass. He names cities in the Americas, describes their architecture, notes their positions along energy grid lines, all supposedly 3 centuries before Columbus sailed, and over a century before any European map showed the Western Hemisphere with any accuracy whatsoever. Either the manuscript is an elaborate modern forgery, which forensic analysis of the parchment and ink has repeatedly ruled out, or someone in 1357 possessed knowledge of global geography that officially did not exist for another several hundred years. The implications of this are staggering. If the manuscript is authentic, and all physical testing suggests it is, then our entire understanding of medieval knowledge and global contact before the age of exploration must be fundamentally reconsidered. Let us examine the specific geographic claims. The manuscript describes a city it calls America's Heart, positioned where modern St. Louis stands, at the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, noting its great mound structures and copper-domed buildings. It describes the city as a major node in the global energy network, connected to other nodes through underground channels and atmospheric transmission systems that drew power from the Earth itself and distributed it wirelessly across vast distances. The manuscript notes that this city's mound structures were aligned with astronomical precision to capture and focus specific frequencies, that they were not primitive burial sites, as we are now told, but sophisticated technological installations serving the energy grid. Modern archaeology admits the mound structures exist, but insists they were built by primitive peoples for ceremonial purposes, refusing to test them for electromagnetic properties, or investigate the underground chambers that ground-penetrating radar consistently reveals beneath them. The manuscript predicted this dismissal, noting that future inheritors would misunderstand or deliberately misrepresent the purpose of these structures, because acknowledging their true function would undermine the narrative of primitive America awaiting European civilization. Moving across the Atlantic, The manuscript describes the cities of Europa with equal precision, noting that the grand cathedrals of France, Spain, and Italy were not originally Christian churches, but power stations serving the Tartarian energy grid. The author describes their spires as atmospheric collectors, their rose windows as frequency calibrators, their vast interior spaces as resonance chambers designed to accumulate and distribute energy through principles we are only now beginning to rediscover. He notes that these buildings were constructed using acoustic levitation and frequency-based stone shaping, techniques that required no massive labor forces because the technology did the work that official history attributes to generations of medieval craftsmen. This explains what historians call the cathedral mystery, how medieval Europe, supposedly emerging from the Dark Ages with limited resources and primitive technology, suddenly produced architectural achievements that modern engineers struggle to replicate with all our advanced equipment. The manuscript says there is no mystery. These buildings were not products of medieval Christian Europe. They were Tartarian infrastructure, repurposed and renamed after the catastrophe, by inheritors who found them standing and claimed them as their own cultural achievements. The author provides technical details that a medieval forger could not have invented. He describes the specific frequencies at which the cathedral systems operated, measurements that align precisely with the resonant properties modern acoustic engineers have measured in these buildings. He describes the underground tunnel networks connecting major cathedrals, tunnels that official archaeology acknowledges exist, but dismisses as crypts or medieval passages, ignoring their consistent dimensions and smooth-bore construction that suggests machine rather than hand excavation. He notes that the original windows were not colored glass depicting religious scenes, but crystalline panels of specific composition designed to filter and focus incoming light at frequencies that activated the interior power systems for collection and distribution. Modern restorations have replaced these original windows with the religious imagery we now associate with cathedrals, part of the rebranding process that transformed technological infrastructure into religious monuments serving entirely different purposes than their builders intended. The manuscript specifically warns that this transformation would occur, that the new authorities would reshape the building's meaning to serve their religious and political purposes, erasing the technological heritage that these structures actually represented. Perhaps the most detailed section of the manuscript describes what it calls the world grid, a global network of energy generation and distribution that connected every major city on Earth through a combination of underground channels and atmospheric transmission. The author maps this grid with precision, noting major nodes, transmission pathways, and the specific architectural features that identified buildings connected to the system. Features we can still observe today if we know what we are looking for. Star forts appear prominently in this mapping, not as military installations designed for defense against cannon fire, as we are told, but as energy collection and distribution hubs, their distinctive shape designed to capture and focus atmospheric electrical energy. The manuscript notes that star forts were always positioned at specific geographic points where natural energy flows concentrated, often at the confluence of rivers, on prominent hills, or at locations where underground water and mineral deposits created optimal conditions. Modern maps of star fort locations confirm this pattern. They appear at consistent intervals along specific latitudinal and longitudinal lines, as if positioned according to a global plan rather than random military necessity, as official history claims. The author describes the technology itself, what modern researchers call Antiquitech, using terms that combine medieval vocabulary with concepts that suggest understanding far beyond his supposed era, and far beyond what any medieval European should have known. He writes of atmospheric ether being captured through spired structures, channeled through crystalline conductors, accumulated in domed reservoirs, and distributed through copper networks to illuminate cities, power machinery, and enable communication across vast distances. This sounds like fantasy until you examine the buildings themselves. The spires were almost universally topped with copper or gold. The domes were lined with specific metals. The underground tunnels contained traces of copper wiring that official archaeology has never adequately explained. The manuscript describes this technology not as magic, but as natural philosophy, the application of understood principles to practical purposes. Knowledge accumulated over millennia of observation and experimentation by a civilization far older and more sophisticated than we have been taught. The author expresses concern that this knowledge will be lost in the coming catastrophe, that survivors will lack the understanding to maintain or replicate the systems, that humanity will fall into a dark age from which recovery will take centuries, or perhaps never fully occur. One-world architecture is how the manuscript describes the standardized building styles that appeared across the Tartarian Empire, distinctive features that identify structures as part of the global system, regardless of their current location or the culture that now claims them. These features include the elaborate facade ornamentation that official history calls merely decorative, but which the manuscript identifies as functional components of the energy collection system, calibrated to specific frequencies and positioned with mathematical precision. The identical architectural elements appearing in buildings across continents, from the Americas to Asia to Africa, are explained by official history as coincidental parallel development or cultural diffusion. But the manuscript says they were built by the same civilization using standardized designs. The author provides measurements and proportions, noting that these buildings follow consistent mathematical ratios that optimize their energetic function. Ratios based on principles of sacred geometry that we are only now rediscovering through alternative research. He warns that future inheritors will strip these buildings of their functional elements, replacing copper roofing with cheaper materials, filling underground chambers with concrete, removing the crystalline components that allowed the systems to operate, leaving only empty architectural shells. This is exactly what we observe in historical records of building renovations throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Copper roofing was removed and sold for scrap. Underground levels were filled or sealed. Original equipment was disposed of as mysterious junk from forgotten eras. The process was sometimes documented by those who carried it out, workmen who noted the strange materials they were removing, the unusual configurations they were destroying, the evidence of sophisticated systems they could not understand but were paid to eliminate. These workers' accounts survive in scattered archives, dismissed as uneducated misunderstanding of medieval construction. But their descriptions match the manuscript's accounts of what these buildings originally contained before the systematic stripping that followed the Great Reset. The reset itself is the subject of Act 2, but understanding the architecture first is essential. These buildings were not empty shells waiting to be filled with modern purpose. They were functional infrastructure that was deliberately decommissioned before being repurposed. The manuscript makes clear that this decommissioning would be necessary for the new authorities to maintain control. A population with access to free energy and global communication could not be dominated. The technology had to be removed before the new order could be imposed. Let us examine specific buildings that the manuscript describes and that still stand today, comparing its medieval descriptions to what we can observe with our own eyes and measure with modern instruments, if we are permitted access to conduct such measurements. The manuscript describes what is now called St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, not as a church, but as the central hub of the European energy grid, noting its dome as the primary collection point and its underground levels as the distribution center for the entire Mediterranean region. It describes the obelisk in the square as an antenna, part of the atmospheric transmission system, noting that similar obelisks appeared at nodes throughout the grid, always positioned with precise mathematical relationships to surrounding structures. Modern research has confirmed that the Vatican sits atop one of the most extensive underground complexes in Europe, with tunnels extending for miles in every direction. Yet public access to these tunnels is strictly prohibited, and their true extent is not officially acknowledged. Ground-penetrating radar surveys, conducted covertly by researchers who understood what they might find, revealed chambers and passages far beyond what the Vatican has ever admitted, with architectural features matching the manuscript's descriptions of energy distribution infrastructure. The manuscript describes Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, now Istanbul, as a sister station to the Vatican hub, the eastern anchor of the European grid, noting its distinctive dome as an energy reservoir of enormous capacity designed to serve the entire eastern Mediterranean and beyond. It describes underground connections between the Hagia Sophia and other buildings in the ancient city, water channels that were not merely aqueducts, but conduits for the energy distribution system, using the properties of flowing water to transmit power across distances. When the building was converted to a mosque after the Ottoman conquest, the manuscript had predicted that its original function would be concealed, that new religious significance would be imposed to obscure the technological heritage that the structure actually represented. The Ottomans added minarets to the structure, which the manuscript describes as additional atmospheric collection points that actually enhanced the building's original function, even as they transformed its religious identity from Christian cathedral to Islamic mosque to modern museum. Today, the building draws millions of visitors who admire its architectural beauty, without understanding that they are standing inside what may have been one of the most sophisticated power generation facilities ever constructed by human hands before the Great Forgetting. Across the Atlantic, the manuscript describes the structures of the American continents with equal detail, noting that the great civilizations of the Americas were not isolated developments, but integral parts of the global Tartarian network, connected through the same energy grid. It describes the pyramid complexes of Mexico and Central America, not as temples or tombs, but as power generation facilities. Their stepped shapes designed to accumulate atmospheric energy, their interior chambers calibrated to specific frequencies for collection and transmission. The manuscript notes that these structures were positioned along energy lines that continued north into what is now the United States, connecting to the mound complexes and eventually to facilities along the eastern seaboard that have since been destroyed or buried beyond recognition. It describes a great city where modern New York stands, noting its position at a natural energy concentration point, where multiple grid lines converged, making it ideal for a major hub even before the current city was built atop whatever remains of the original structures. The author expresses particular concern for the American facilities, noting that they would be most vulnerable in the coming catastrophe, positioned along coastlines and river systems that would bear the brunt of the mudflood events he predicted with such disturbing accuracy. The chapter of the manuscript devoted to maps is perhaps its most controversial element, containing what appears to be descriptions of geographic features and city locations that no medieval European should have known, proving either forgery or knowledge we cannot explain. The author describes the Pacific Ocean with island chains in their correct positions, notes the western coastline of the Americas with its distinctive features, and places cities along the coast of what is now California, centuries before any European officially reached those shores. He describes the interior of Africa with knowledge of river systems, mountain ranges, and kingdoms that Europeans would not officially document until the 19th century. Yet his descriptions match what later explorers would find with remarkable accuracy. Either someone in 1357 had access to geographic knowledge from sources we know nothing about, or the manuscript is a forgery. But every scientific test of the physical document has confirmed its medieval origin, leaving us with a mystery that official history cannot resolve. The manuscript itself suggests the answer. The Tartarian civilization maintained global communications and travel networks that Europeans had lost access to after the fragmentation of the empire, knowledge that persisted in some quarters long after it was officially forgotten. The author claims to have traveled extensively, to have visited facilities on multiple continents, to have studied the grid systems and understood their operation before the catastrophe he knew was coming, writing his account to preserve knowledge for those who would come after. He describes sea voyages that would have been impossible with medieval European navigation technology, crossing oceans with apparent ease, following routes that suggest knowledge of currents and winds that would not be officially documented for centuries afterward. He describes overland journeys across territories that medieval Europeans considered impassable wilderness, noting infrastructure that enabled rapid travel, way stations that provided supplies, communication systems that allowed coordination across vast distances. If his account is accurate, the medieval world was not the fragmented, isolated collection of competing kingdoms we have been taught, but a single, interconnected civilization where travel and communication were routine and knowledge flowed freely across all boundaries. The catastrophe the author describes would not only destroy physical infrastructure, but would sever these connections, isolating survivors in pockets that would gradually forget they had ever been part of something larger, that would eventually believe they had built everything themselves. The manuscript describes the energy grid in technical detail that reveals understanding far beyond medieval European science, using terminology that modern electrical engineers have been able to interpret once they realized what the author was actually describing. He writes of etheric currents flowing through the earth itself, channeled by underground waterways and mineral deposits, concentrated at specific geographic points where they could be tapped and utilized by properly designed structures, positioned with mathematical precision. He describes the atmosphere as an ocean of energy, constantly replenished by solar radiation and telluric forces, available to any civilization sophisticated enough to build the collection systems, free and unlimited, once the infrastructure was in place and properly maintained. This concept of free atmospheric energy matches precisely with the theories of Nikola Tesla, who claimed to have rediscovered principles for wireless energy transmission that he believed ancient civilizations had mastered long before modern science even recognized electricity as a phenomenon. Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, never completed due to withdrawal of funding, matched the specifications the manuscript provides for energy transmission nodes, leading some researchers to wonder if Tesla had somehow accessed fragments of this forbidden knowledge. The manuscript describes the collection's spires as functioning through resonance, vibrating at frequencies that matched natural energy flows, amplifying and directing power towards central collection points where it could be accumulated and distributed through the network. Every major building in the Tartarian system incorporated these principles, from the humblest municipal structure to the grandest cathedral or palace, creating a civilization powered entirely by natural forces, without combustion, without pollution, without the centralized control that fossil fuels require. This decentralized energy system would have made tyranny nearly impossible. No authority could control access to power that flowed freely from the atmosphere and earth. Every community, every individual, could be independent of centralized systems that could be used for control. The manuscript notes this explicitly, describing the energy grid as the foundation of Tartarian freedom, the technological basis for a society where no one could be enslaved through control of basic necessities, where independence was built into the infrastructure itself. This may explain more than anything else why the system had to be destroyed, why the inheritors who came after had to remove the technology before establishing their new order. Free energy meant free people. Dependent energy meant controllable populations. The author describes the buildings themselves as instruments, precisely tuned to specific frequencies, their proportions calculated according to mathematical principles that created optimal resonance conditions for the collection and distribution of atmospheric energy. He provides detailed ratios and measurements, specifications that can be compared to surviving buildings, and when researchers have made these comparisons, they have found remarkable correspondence between the manuscript's descriptions and actual architectural measurements taken in the field. The golden ratio appears consistently throughout these specifications, along with other mathematical relationships that modern researchers have identified as fundamental to acoustic and electromagnetic resonance, suggesting knowledge of physics that medieval Europeans officially did not possess. Sacred geometry, dismissed by mainstream academia as mystical nonsense, emerges from the manuscript as applied physics, the mathematical language by which the Tartarian builders encoded functional specifications into architectural forms that operated as precise instruments. Every ornamental detail served a purpose. Every curve and angle was calculated. Nothing was merely decorative in the modern sense. The elaborate facades that we admire as artistic expression were functional components of a sophisticated technological system. The manuscript describes the operators of this system, the trained technicians who maintained the grid, calibrated the instruments, and ensured the continuous flow of energy throughout the network, spanning continents and serving populations in the millions. These operators were educated in specialized schools, trained in principles that combined what we would call physics, engineering, and mathematics, with knowledge of natural cycles and cosmic influences that modern science has only begun to investigate and largely dismisses as superstition. The author himself was apparently one of these operators, or had access to their knowledge, describing the training and understanding required to maintain the systems in terms that suggest personal experience rather than second-hand reporting. He expresses concern that this knowledge will be lost after the catastrophe, that survivors will lack both the understanding and the intact infrastructure to continue operating the systems, that humanity will fall into dependence on primitive alternatives that will take centuries to develop. This concern proved prophetic. After the events the manuscript describes, humanity returned to burning wood and animal oils for light and heat, losing in a single generation capabilities that had taken millennia to develop and that we have still not fully recovered today. The chapter on Antiquitech concludes with a catalog of devices and systems that the author had personally observed in operation, descriptions that read like science fiction, but match physical artifacts that have been found and dismissed as decorative or ceremonial objects. He describes lighting systems that operated without flame, providing illumination through principles we might recognize as related to gas discharge or phosphorescence, devices that were standard equipment in every major building before the catastrophe destroyed the networks that powered them. He describes communication devices that transmitted voice and image across distances without wires, using the atmospheric medium that also carried energy, allowing instant connection between any points on the grid, regardless of the physical distance separating them. He describes transportation systems that moved people and goods along the grid lines at speeds we would consider impossible for pre-industrial technology, utilizing the same energy flows that powered everything else, integrated into a system where travel required no fuel and generated no pollution. Most intriguingly, he describes healing technologies that used frequency and vibration to restore health, devices that could diagnose illness, accelerate recovery, and even regenerate damaged tissue through the application of specific energy patterns tailored to individual conditions. These descriptions have led some researchers to dismiss the manuscript as obvious fantasy, the wish fulfillment dreams of a medieval mind imagining capabilities beyond their reach. But the author's technical precision suggests something more than imagination. He provides specifications that can be tested, measurements that can be verified, descriptions that correspond to physical evidence that still exists if we know where to look and what we are examining. The dismissal may be premature. The first act of our investigation has established what the manuscript claims. A global civilization possessed technologies we have been told did not exist. Technologies whose traces remain visible in architecture around the world, if we can learn to recognize them. The question now becomes, what happened to this civilization? How did such an advanced society disappear from history? What catastrophe could have been so complete that it required rewriting history itself to conceal that anything had ever existed before? Act 2 will examine the event the manuscript calls the Mud Flood, the catastrophe that buried the Tartarian world, that created the buried first floors and impossible basements we find in cities around the world, that ended one age and began another, built on forgotten foundations. Act 2, the Mud Flood event. The manuscript does not merely describe a past civilization. It predicts a coming catastrophe with such specific detail that we can examine physical evidence to determine whether the predicted events actually occurred as described. The author writes from the perspective of someone who knows catastrophe is approaching, who has seen the signs that indicate the current age is ending, who is creating a record for those who will survive what is coming and need to understand what was lost. He describes a series of events that will occur in sequence. First, atmospheric disturbances as the energy grid destabilizes. Then, tectonic shifts as the Earth itself responds to the imbalance. And finally, massive waves of mud and water that will bury everything in their path. The mud will come not from floods in the conventional sense, but from liquefaction of the ground itself, soil transformed into flowing slurry by vibrations and water saturation, moving across landscapes like slow-motion tsunamis, burying everything to depths measured in meters. This description matches geological phenomena we have documented in modern times during earthquakes and other seismic events. But the scale the manuscript describes exceeds anything in recorded history, a global event affecting every populated region simultaneously. The manuscript provides specific predictions about what will be buried and how deep, noting that buildings in low-lying areas will be completely submerged, while structures on higher ground will survive with only their upper floors visible above the new ground level. Cities will become archaeological sites overnight, their streets and ground floors transformed into underground passages, their windows becoming basement windows looking into soil rather than onto avenues that once bustled with activity and commerce. The author predicts that survivors will eventually excavate some structures, digging down to access the buried levels, but will lack understanding of what they find, interpreting functional infrastructure as mysterious basements of unknown purpose. This prediction has proven remarkably accurate. Cities around the world contain buildings with buried first floors, underground levels that original architectural plans show as ground-level entrances, impossible basements that official history has never adequately explained. The pattern is global and consistent. St. Petersburg, Melbourne, Portland, Cincinnati, San Francisco. Cities on every inhabited continent show evidence of burial events that transformed their architecture in exactly the ways the manuscript describes. Let us examine the evidence systematically, beginning with the documented anomalies that historians and architects have long recognized but have struggled to explain within the framework of conventional history and natural geological processes. In city after city, buildings that official history dates to the 19th century or earlier contain basement levels that make no architectural sense. Underground floors with elaborate ornamentation, windows positioned to look onto streets that are now several meters below current grade. Original photographs from the mid-19th century often show these buildings partially excavated, workers removing soil from around first-floor windows, digging down to access entrances that were somehow buried despite the buildings being supposedly only decades old at the time. The official explanation is that streets were raised for sanitation or flood control, that buildings were constructed with anticipation of future grade changes. But this explanation fails to account for the global scale of the phenomenon and its consistent characteristics across unconnected cities. Why would cities on opposite sides of the world, developed independently with no coordination, all decide to raise their streets by similar amounts at approximately the same time? Why would architects design elaborate facades to be buried underground from the beginning? The manuscript answers these questions directly. The burial was not planned, but catastrophic, not gradual, but sudden, not local, but global. What we see is not urban planning, but evidence of the catastrophe the author predicted centuries before it occurred. In St. Petersburg, Russia, buildings officially constructed in the 18th and 19th centuries sit atop buried levels that contain architectural features matching the original above-ground floors, windows, doorways, and ornamentation, now sealed beneath the street. Excavations in recent decades have revealed these buried levels in detail, though public access remains restricted and official explanations remain unconvincing. The buildings were not designed to be partially underground. They were buried by an event no one wants to discuss. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed the extent of buried structures throughout the city, showing that what we see on the surface is literally the tip of the iceberg, with entire floors and, in some cases, entire additional buildings existing beneath the current street level. Local historians have documented this anomaly for over a century, developing various theories to explain it, but none of the conventional explanations account for all the evidence. And the most parsimonious explanation remains the one the manuscript provides. Melbourne, Australia, presents similar evidence on the opposite side of the world, with 19th century buildings containing buried basements that original plans show as ground floors, underground windows that once looked onto streets, sealed entrances that once welcomed visitors. The official explanation in Melbourne involves periodic flooding of the Yarra River, but the burial levels are consistent across areas with different flood risks, and the architectural features of the buried floors suggest they were finished living and commercial spaces, not flood-prone basements. Portland, Oregon contains an extensive underground network that official history attributes to various purposes, from Shanghai tunnels for kidnapping sailors to storage facilities for local businesses. But the architecture suggests something more systematic and sophisticated than these explanations allow. The tunnels connect buildings in patterns that match the manuscript's descriptions of energy distribution networks, running between structures that would have been nodes in the grid, following paths that align with the geometry the author describes for Tartarian infrastructure. Cincinnati, Ohio, has an entire buried city beneath its current streets. The famous Cincinnati subway system that was never completed, and the older structures it passes through. Evidence of pre-existing infrastructure that the subway project accidentally revealed. The manuscript predicts that evidence of the buried civilization would be discovered by later inheritors attempting to build their own infrastructure. That construction projects would repeatedly encounter anomalies that could not be explained by official historical narratives. This prediction has proven accurate countless times. Construction workers around the world regularly report encountering buried structures, sophisticated stonework, and mysterious artifacts that are quietly removed, documented only in workers' accounts, never publicly acknowledged. In some cases, construction is delayed or redirected to avoid buried structures that authorities apparently prefer to leave undisturbed. In other cases, discoveries are quickly excavated, cataloged by unknown agencies, and removed before public awareness can develop. The manuscript warns that this would happen, that the new authorities would work to conceal evidence of what came before, that maintaining the official narrative would require constant vigilance against the physical evidence that threatened to expose the truth. The author advises future readers to trust their own observations over official explanations, to examine the buildings themselves, to ask questions that authorities seem unwilling to answer, to recognize that the truth is visible to anyone willing to see it. Let us examine what the buried levels contain when they can be accessed and documented. These are not rough basements carved from soil, but finished architectural spaces with ornamentation matching the surviving upper floors in quality and sophistication. Walls are plastered and painted. Floors are tiled or finished wood. Windows are framed with the same detailed moldings found above. These were living spaces, commercial spaces, public spaces, now inexplicably underground, with no coherent explanation from official sources. The manuscript describes these levels as they were originally built. Ground floors designed for public interaction, entrances that welcomed visitors, windows positioned for light and air, spaces that make sense only when imagined at their original grade level, rather than buried beneath tons of soil. In many buildings, the current ground floor was originally the second floor, with exterior staircases and entrances that make no sense until you understand that the original ground level is now underground, that what we call the basement was once the main floor. Architectural historians have documented these anomalies extensively, publishing papers and books that present the evidence while offering explanations that never quite satisfy, that leave essential questions unanswered, that avoid the conclusion the evidence most clearly supports. The manuscript provides a timeline for the mud flood events, describing them as occurring in waves over a period that corresponds roughly to the late 18th and 19th centuries, a period that conventional history treats as one of the most documented and understood eras of human development. Yet this same period contains enormous gaps and anomalies that historians have long recognized without resolving. Entire cities appear with impossibly complete infrastructure. Technologies emerge without apparent development history. Population figures fluctuate in ways that suggest massive, undocumented events. The manuscript explains these anomalies as consequences of the catastrophe and its aftermath. Cities that seem to appear suddenly were actually excavated from burial. Technologies that seem to emerge from nowhere were recovered from buried facilities. Population changes reflect the deaths of many and arrival of new inheritors. This framework resolves contradictions that conventional history leaves unexplained, providing a coherent narrative that accounts for evidence that otherwise must be dismissed as coincidence, error, or mystery beyond the scope of historical investigation. The mud flood hypothesis is not speculation invented by modern alternative researchers. It is the explicit prediction of a medieval manuscript that describes a catastrophe that physical evidence suggests actually occurred, worldwide, within the time frame the author anticipated. The mechanism of the mud flood deserves careful examination because it differs from conventional flood events in ways that explain the specific pattern of evidence we observe in buildings and cities around the world today. Conventional floods deposit sediment in layers, leave high water marks, and drain relatively quickly, allowing cleanup and recovery. The mud flood described in the manuscript operated differently, depositing material that remained in place, that hardened, that became permanent, new ground level. The author describes a process of liquefaction combined with mass movement, where vibrations caused by the initial catastrophe transformed stable soil into flowing slurry that moved across landscapes like slow-motion avalanches, filling valleys and accumulating against structures in its path. This explains why buildings were buried to consistent depths within geographic areas, why the burial material compacted into soil-like layers rather than remaining loose sediment, why drainage did not remove the deposits as it would with conventional flooding. Modern geology recognizes liquefaction as a real phenomenon, documented during earthquakes and other seismic events, but typically on scales measured in meters, rather than the tens of meters the manuscript describes for the catastrophic events of the late Tartarian period. The manuscript suggests that the scale of the mudflood events was magnified by the collapse of the energy grid itself, that the same systems which had provided power and stability to the civilization also held geological forces in balance that would be released when the grid failed. This is a remarkable claim with implications for our understanding of the technology. If accurate, the Tartarian energy grid was not merely a power generation system, but a planetary stabilization network that prevented natural catastrophes that would otherwise occur more frequently. The author describes the grid as working with natural forces rather than against them, channeling energies that would otherwise build to destructive release, maintaining equilibrium that allowed civilization to flourish in regions that would otherwise be uninhabitable due to seismic or climatic instability. When the grid began to fail, whether through deliberate sabotage, accumulated damage, or simple degradation over time, these contained forces were released in a cascade of events that transformed the global landscape and buried the civilization that had maintained the system. This explanation accounts for the global simultaneity of the mudflood events, why cities on different continents experienced similar burial at approximately the same time, why the catastrophe was not merely local, but affected the entire planetary system the grid had been maintaining. Evidence of rapid burial events appears in the geological and archaeological record, though mainstream science interprets this evidence within frameworks that preclude recognition of the global technological civilization the manuscript describes. Peat bogs and sediment layers contain evidence of sudden changes in vegetation, of forests buried rapidly, of soil composition shifts that suggest massive disturbance events rather than the gradual changes that uniformitarian geology prefers to emphasize. The boundaries between geological periods are increasingly recognized as marking catastrophic transitions rather than gradual evolution, events that transformed entire ecosystems in timeframes too short to fit comfortable narratives of slow change over millions of years. The manuscript places the mudflood within this pattern of catastrophic transitions, describing it as the most recent in a series of such events, each of which reset civilization and required humanity to begin again from the ruins of what had been destroyed. If this cyclical pattern is accurate, then our current civilization exists in a vulnerable position, building on foundations we do not understand, using technologies that work against nature rather than with it, potentially heading toward another catastrophic reset. The evidence of burial is perhaps most dramatic in cities that official history claims were built in the 19th century, supposedly the best documented era of human development, yet containing buildings whose architecture makes sense only if they predate the period of their supposed construction. Chicago provides a striking example. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 is blamed for destroying the original city. But photographs from shortly after the fire show elaborate stone buildings that supposedly survived flames hot enough to melt iron and somehow remained standing amid total devastation. More mysteriously, these surviving buildings show evidence of burial, with first floors at or below the new ground level, requiring excavation to access entrances that photographs from before the fire show were at street level. The fire did not bury them. Something else did. The official narrative has Chicago rebuilt to higher standards within just a few years of the fire, with buildings of such sophistication that modern architects wonder how the supposedly primitive construction techniques of the era could have produced them so quickly and completely. The manuscript's framework offers an alternative explanation. The elaborate buildings were not built after the fire, but were Tartarian structures that survived the mud flood partially buried, that were excavated and repurposed by inheritors who claimed them as their own construction. San Francisco presents similar anomalies, with buildings that survived the 1906 earthquake and fire showing evidence of prior burial, underground levels that make no sense as original construction, windows that once looked onto streets now several feet below current grade. The official explanation involves raising street levels for various urban improvements, but the scale and consistency of the burial, combined with the elaborate finish of the underground spaces, suggests something other than planned construction on foundations designed to be eventually underground. Every major American city contains similar evidence when examined with awareness of what to look for. Buried first floors, underground windows, elaborate basements that were clearly designed as primary spaces, architecture that makes sense only when imagined at a different ground level. The manuscript predicted this pattern would be found worldwide, that surviving structures would confuse inheritors, who would develop elaborate but unconvincing explanations, rather than accept the obvious conclusion that the buildings predated the supposed era of their construction. This prediction has proven accurate. Architectural historians have developed countless theories to explain the buried buildings, each theory addressing some evidence while ignoring other evidence, none providing the comprehensive explanation that the mud flood hypothesis offers. Beyond the building evidence, the manuscript describes how the mud flood would transform landscapes themselves, filling valleys, damming rivers, creating new lakes and wetlands where none had existed before, fundamentally reshaping geography in ways that would confuse future inhabitants. Comparing historical maps from before the mid-19th century with modern maps reveals exactly these kinds of geographic changes: rivers that no longer exist, lakes that appeared suddenly, coastlines that shifted, terrain features that seem to have emerged from nowhere. Official geography attributes these changes to natural processes or human engineering, but the scale and timing of the changes correspond more closely to the manuscript's predictions of catastrophic transformation than to gradual evolution or documented construction projects. The author describes how forests would be buried under mud, their preserved trunks becoming the coal and fossil fuel deposits that future generations would discover and exploit, not realizing they were consuming the remains of the previous civilization's carefully managed landscapes. This claim is perhaps the most controversial in the manuscript, suggesting that coal and petroleum are not ancient deposits from millions of years ago, but relatively recent organic material buried and transformed by catastrophes within human historical memory. The mud flood was not a single event, but a series of waves over decades or possibly centuries, with the manuscript describing early warning events that Tartarian authorities recognized but could not prevent, followed by progressively larger catastrophes as the grid continued to fail. This extended timeline explains why some buildings show multiple burial levels, why some cities have evidence of repeated excavation and reburial, why the ground level in some areas seems to have changed several times within periods that official history treats as stable and well documented. The manuscript describes evacuation efforts as the situation worsened, populations moving to higher ground, attempts to maintain critical infrastructure as long as possible, the gradual collapse of systems that had operated for centuries or millennia before the final catastrophic failures. These accounts of decline and evacuation explain demographic shifts that official history struggles to account for, population movements that seem to have occurred without documented cause, cities that were abandoned, and others that were suddenly established in locations that made little sense geographically. The survivors of the mud flood would have found themselves in a transformed world, cut off from the technology and communication systems they had depended upon, forced to adapt to conditions that bore little resemblance to the civilization they had known before. Act 2 has examined the evidence for the catastrophe the manuscript predicts, the mud flood that buried Tartarian civilization, the physical traces that remain visible in cities around the world, the patterns that official history acknowledges without explaining adequately. The evidence is extensive, global, and consistent. Buildings buried to their first floors, underground windows looking onto what were once streets, elaborate basements that were clearly designed as primary living and commercial spaces, archaeological anomalies that appear whenever construction disturbs supposedly undeveloped ground. The question that now arises is what happened next? If the mud flood buried Tartarian civilization, who excavated the structures? Who claimed the buildings? Who wrote the history we were taught? Who are the inheritors? And how did they accomplish the great reset of human memory? Act 3 will examine the period after the mud flood, the arrival of new populations, the excavation and repurposing of surviving structures, the systematic erasure of knowledge about what came before, and the creation of the false historical narrative that has dominated education and culture ever since. Act 3, The Great Reset. The catastrophe was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one in which surviving structures would be claimed by inheritors who had not built them, and who would work systematically to erase all memory of those who had. The manuscript describes what would happen after the mud flood with the same precision it applies to the catastrophe itself, predicting the arrival of new populations, the excavation of buried cities, and the rewriting of history that would attribute everything to the newcomers. The author writes with evident sorrow about this coming erasure, knowing that the civilization he served would be forgotten, that its achievements would be claimed by others, that the truth would survive only in documents like the one he was creating for future generations. He describes the inheritors not as villains, but as opportunists, people who would find vast wealth already built and would rationalize claiming it as their own, who would develop elaborate histories to justify their possession of things they could not have created themselves. This psychological insight rings true across human experience. People who inherit wealth or power they did not earn typically develop narratives that justify their position, that attribute their success to merit rather than circumstance, that erase the contributions of those who came before. The excavation process described in the manuscript matches what we observe in historical photographs and documents from the 19th century, images that supposedly show new construction but actually reveal workers digging down to buildings that were already standing, already built, already there. Photographs from cities across America show construction crews at ground level, with elaborate buildings already rising behind them. Buildings whose architectural sophistication seems impossible for workers supposedly constructing them with the primitive techniques available at the supposed date of construction. The manuscript explains these images. The workers were not building, but excavating, not constructing, but recovering structures that the mud flood had buried, removing soil from around buildings that Tartarian engineers had created generations or centuries before the supposed founding dates. Close examination of these historical photographs reveals disturbing details. Workers posed with tools but no construction materials. Finished buildings supposedly under construction with no scaffolding or staging. Grand openings of structures that show clear evidence of prior existence. The photographic record of 19th century urban development, examined with awareness of what the manuscript describes, becomes evidence not of construction, but of discovery, not of building, but of inheriting, not of creation, but of claiming what already existed. The renaming of buildings was essential to the reset process described in the manuscript. Structures that had served specific technological purposes in the Tartarian system had to be given new names, new functions, new histories that concealed their original nature. The manuscript predicts that energy collection facilities would be renamed as churches and cathedrals, that administrative centers would be called government buildings and courthouses, that transportation hubs would be designated as train stations or municipal structures. This prediction aligns precisely with what we observe. The architectural features that identify these buildings as Tartarian infrastructure appear consistently across structures now given completely different purposes in different cities, different countries, different continents. The ornamental elements, the precise proportions, the positioning relative to other structures in the grid, all these identifying features persist in buildings now called churches, banks, libraries, city halls, and government centers across the post-reset world. The inheritors could not remove these features without destroying the buildings themselves, so they renamed and repurposed, while leaving the physical evidence of original function visible to anyone who knows what they are looking at and has the courage to draw obvious conclusions. Capitol buildings in the United States provide striking examples of this repurposing process. These structures appear in cities across the country with architectural features that match the manuscript's descriptions of major grid nodes. Yet each is attributed to local 19th century construction. The Wisconsin State Capitol, the Pennsylvania State Capitol, the California State Capitol. Building after building shows the same architectural DNA, the same proportions, the same ornamental programs, as if built from the same plans by the same civilization. Official history explains this similarity as the spread of neoclassical architectural style. But the manuscript offers a different explanation. These buildings were already standing when the inheritors arrived, built by Tartarian engineers to standardized specifications for grid network nodes. The inheritors found them, claimed them, and developed the story of neoclassical architecture spreading across the new nation to explain why buildings in Oregon looked like buildings in Massachusetts, why structures in newly settled territories matched those in long-established cities. The neoclassical narrative became the cover story for A Continental Inheritance, a way of explaining suspicious architectural uniformity without acknowledging that the uniformity predated the supposed construction by centuries or longer. The manuscript describes how the inheritors would strip the buildings of their technological components while preserving the impressive shells, removing copper wiring, crystalline elements, and the mechanisms that had made the structures functional, while leaving facades that could still impress visitors. Historical records confirm this stripping process, documenting the removal of original roofing materials, the filling of underground chambers with concrete, the replacement of original fixtures with conventional alternatives that served no function beyond basic utility. Workers who participated in these removals sometimes recorded what they found, noting unusual materials, mysterious mechanisms, components they could not identify but were ordered to dispose of without documentation. These accounts survive in scattered archives, corroborating the manuscript's predictions. The stripping was systematic and thorough, carried out across decades throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, transforming functional infrastructure into empty monuments whose original purpose would become increasingly difficult to reconstruct as evidence was destroyed. By the time the stripping was complete, the buildings retained only their architectural shells, impressive but inert. Monuments to a capability no one could any longer explain or replicate, attributed to the inheritors who had merely claimed what remained after the technology was removed. Education became the primary tool of the reset, teaching each new generation a false history that attributed the inherited structures to recent construction, that erased the Tartarian civilization from memory, that created the framework of belief we now accept as obvious and unquestionable truth. The manuscript predicts this educational indoctrination with remarkable precision, describing how schools would teach children that their grandparents had built the magnificent structures they saw, that humanity had progressed from primitive to sophisticated within living memory. This narrative of recent progress served multiple purposes. It made the inheritance seem legitimate. It prevented questions about technological capability that no longer existed. It established the new authorities as the culmination of human achievement rather than the inheritors of others' work. Within 2 or 3 generations, the truth would be almost impossible to recover. Those who remembered differently would die. Their descendants would learn the new history in schools. The reset would be complete. The erasure would be permanent. The lie would become the only reality anyone could imagine. We are the products of this educational system, taught from childhood to accept the historical narrative the inheritors created, trained to dismiss alternatives as conspiracy theory, conditioned to defend the lie against evidence our own eyes could evaluate if we were willing to look. The manuscript describes how certain knowledge would be preserved by the inheritors, even as public awareness was erased, how the new authorities would understand the truth even while teaching false histories to the populations they controlled. This hidden knowledge would be transmitted through secret societies, through elite institutions, through families that maintained awareness across generations, creating a 2-tier system of knowledge: the false public narrative and the true private understanding reserved for those in power. This prediction matches what researchers have documented about elite knowledge transmission, the persistence of esoteric traditions, the architectural symbols embedded in structures that reveal awareness of meanings officially dismissed as nonsense or coincidence. The inheritors knew what they had inherited. They understood, at least partially, what the buildings had been designed to do. They maintained this knowledge among themselves while ensuring that the general public would never have access to information that might threaten their position. The free energy system, if restored, would undermine every structure of control the inheritors had established. A population with independent access to power could not be dominated. The technology had to remain suppressed, even as its infrastructure was hidden in plain sight. The manuscript describes the creation of new origin stories to replace the truth. Myths of founding fathers and pioneer settlers who supposedly built the magnificent structures that the inheritors had actually found already standing when they arrived. In America, this mythology centered on the founding fathers and westward expansion, creating narratives of brave settlers building civilization from wilderness, constructing elaborate cities through hard work and determination, achieving in decades what usually required centuries. The impossible speed of American development is explained in official history by American exceptionalism, by unique national character, by the advantages of building without the constraints of Old World tradition. The manuscript offers a simpler explanation. The buildings were already there. City after city along westward expansion routes appears in historical records with elaborately constructed downtowns from the moment of supposed founding. Magnificent structures that allegedly preceded basic infrastructure like sewers and water systems that would normally be developed first. The manuscript predicts exactly this pattern. Inheritors arriving at sites where Tartarian cities had been partially buried, excavating what they found, claiming it as their own construction, developing origin myths that attributed the impossible to their own ingenuity and labor. The world's fairs of the 19th and early 20th centuries present a particularly striking example of the reset narrative being constructed and reinforced through public spectacle, designed to establish false historical frameworks. These events featured magnificent temporary structures that supposedly were built in months and demolished immediately after the fairs ended, explaining why such architectural wonders no longer exist, without requiring acknowledgement that they might have predated the events themselves. The official narrative strains credibility. Massive buildings of stone and steel erected in impossible time frames, equipped with electrical systems ahead of their era, then destroyed completely, leaving no trace except photographs and memories that could be shaped by those controlling the narrative. The manuscript suggests these fairs served a different purpose: the public presentation of already existing Tartarian structures, temporarily made accessible to demonstrate the capabilities of the current civilization, then closed, and the structures either destroyed or converted to other purposes. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the 1915 San Francisco Panama Pacific Exposition. Event after event featured buildings whose sophistication suggests they could not have been built in the time frames claimed, whose demolition seems culturally and economically inexplicable given their evident quality and beauty. Photographs of these fairs show elaborate structures with architectural features matching the manuscript's descriptions of Tartarian building types, features that appear in permanent buildings that somehow survived while the supposedly temporary fair structures were demolished completely. The electrical illumination demonstrated at these fairs, presented as cutting-edge innovation, was exactly the kind of atmospheric energy capture and distribution the manuscript describes as routine Tartarian technology, perhaps demonstrated at sites where the infrastructure still partially functioned. The manuscript predicts that such demonstrations would be staged, that the inheritors would selectively reveal fragments of the suppressed technology to build their reputation as innovators, taking credit for capabilities they had inherited rather than developed themselves. After these public demonstrations, the same technologies would often disappear from public availability, explained as economically impractical or technically superseded, when they may actually have been suppressed to prevent the general population from accessing the free energy systems they represented. The fairgrounds were often located in areas where the manuscript's descriptions suggest major Tartarian infrastructure would have existed, places where the grid network concentrated, where the most sophisticated facilities would have been positioned before the catastrophe and reset. The manuscript addresses who the inheritors were, not naming specific individuals or families, but describing the characteristics of those who would take possession of the Tartarian heritage and work to erase its memory from human consciousness. They were not the survivors of the mud flood, who remained too traumatized and diminished to organize the recovery. They were newcomers who arrived after the immediate catastrophe had passed, who found a depopulated landscape full of buried wealth waiting to be claimed. The author describes them as organized, well-resourced, and operating according to a plan that suggested advanced knowledge of what they would find and preparation for how they would establish their control over territories and populations that had lost their previous leadership. This description raises disturbing questions about the catastrophe itself. If the inheritors arrived prepared, did they know in advance what was coming? Did they perhaps contribute to the grid failure that triggered the mud flood? Did they clear the way for their own ascension? The manuscript does not answer these questions directly, but implies that the catastrophe may not have been entirely natural, that forces working against Tartarian civilization may have precipitated its collapse, that the reset was not merely opportunistic, but potentially orchestrated. The timeline of the reset, as the manuscript describes it, corresponds to the period historians call the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, presented in official history as a triumph of human progress, but perhaps actually the establishment of a new regime built on stolen foundations. The institutions established during this period, the academic systems, the historical societies, the museums and archives, all these were designed not to preserve truth, but to establish and protect the false narrative that would prevent future generations from understanding what had actually occurred. Universities became gatekeepers of acceptable knowledge, determining what questions could be asked, what evidence could be considered, what conclusions could be drawn, excluding anything that threatened the narrative the inheritors had constructed to legitimize their position. Museums became repositories not just of artifacts, but of interpretive frameworks, teaching visitors how to understand the past in ways that supported official history, displaying Tartarian objects while attributing them to primitive cultures or more recent construction. The manuscript predicts this institutional capture with precision, describing how the inheritors would establish control over knowledge itself, creating systems that would perpetuate their narrative across generations without requiring conscious conspiracy by each subsequent participant. The destruction of records was essential to the reset process. The inheritors could not simply claim the buildings. They had to eliminate evidence that might contradict their claims. Documents and artifacts that revealed the true origins of what they now possessed. The manuscript predicts waves of archive destruction, library fires, museum losses, and bureaucratic purges that would systematically eliminate records of the previous civilization while appearing to be unfortunate accidents or necessary administrative processes. Historical records confirm exactly these patterns. Libraries burned throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, often containing irreplaceable documents about local history that would have contradicted the official narrative being established about when cities were founded and buildings constructed. The Library of Congress fire of 1851, the fires that destroyed records in countless city halls and courthouses, the mysterious losses of archive materials. All these events fit the pattern the manuscript describes of systematic evidence elimination disguised as accident or negligence. What survived was often selectively preserved. Records that supported the new narrative were protected, while records that contradicted it were allowed to deteriorate, were lost in reorganizations, were simply discarded as unnecessary paperwork from a past that officially never existed. Genealogical records present particular anomalies that align with the manuscript's predictions. Family histories that should extend back centuries often terminate abruptly in the late 18th or early 19th century, as if entire populations appeared from nowhere without ancestors. Official explanation attributes these gaps to poor record-keeping in frontier conditions, but the gaps appear too consistently, too completely, and too conveniently for this explanation to satisfy. The manuscript suggests these populations actually were new arrivals, the inheritors who came after the catastrophe. Immigration records from this period show massive population movements whose origins are often vague, people arriving from elsewhere without clear documentation of where elsewhere actually was, settling in areas where they found infrastructure already waiting for them. The manuscript describes this process: inheritor populations moving into depopulated territories, finding Tartarian cities partially buried, excavating and claiming them, developing origin stories that began with their arrival rather than with the true history of what they had found. Within 2 generations, these inheritors would believe their own mythology. Their grandchildren would have no memory of arriving, would grow up believing their families had always been in these places, would accept the false history as unquestionable truth. The manuscript addresses the question of what happened to the original Tartarian populations, the people who had built and maintained the civilization before the catastrophe, who should have survived in numbers sufficient to prevent inheritors from simply taking over their world. The author describes multiple factors reducing the original population: the immediate deaths during the mud flood events, the subsequent deaths from starvation and disease as infrastructure failed, the migrations of survivors to areas less affected by the catastrophe. Those who remained were often absorbed into inheritor populations, their knowledge dismissed as primitive superstition, their accounts of the past ignored or actively suppressed, their descendants eventually forgetting that their ancestors had been anything other than what the new narrative described. The manuscript notes with sorrow that Tartarian knowledge was designed to be maintained by the grid system itself, that without the communication networks that had connected scholars across continents, isolated survivors could not preserve the sophisticated understanding that had been their heritage. Within a generation, Tartarian survivors would become indistinguishable from inheritor populations, their unique knowledge lost, their memories discounted, their descendants believing the new history as firmly as anyone else, because no alternative framework remained accessible. The manuscript describes specific strategies the inheritors would use to suppress technological recovery, ensuring that even if someone rediscovered Tartarian principles, they would be unable to implement them, or would face consequences that discouraged further pursuit. Free energy research would be particularly targeted because it threatened the control structures the inheritors were establishing. A population with independent access to power could not be controlled through energy monopolies, so such research had to be prevented or contained. The author predicts that individuals who came close to recovering the technology would face professional destruction, financial ruin, or worse, that their discoveries would be purchased and suppressed, their names erased from history, their work attributed to others, or simply forgotten. This prediction matches documented patterns of suppressed invention throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Inventors who disappeared, discoveries that vanished, technologies that emerged briefly and were then never heard from again for reasons that were never adequately explained. Nikola Tesla, the most famous example, allegedly recovered working free energy technology only to have his funding withdrawn, his laboratory destroyed by fire, his papers confiscated after his death, his most revolutionary work erased from public knowledge for decades. The reset narrative was not simply passive suppression, but active construction, a deliberately crafted story designed to explain everything the inheritors now possessed, without revealing anything about how they had actually obtained it, or who had created it originally. The story of human progress, from primitive to sophisticated, became the foundation of this narrative, presenting history as a steady advance from caves to castles to modern convenience, with the inheritors' era as the natural culmination of this inevitable advancement. Evidence that contradicted this progress narrative was dismissed as anomaly, attributed to lost civilizations that had mysteriously vanished, explained as coincidence or contamination or misinterpretation. Anything except the obvious conclusion that the timeline was fundamentally wrong. The manuscript describes how this dismissal would work, how obvious evidence would be ignored, how researchers who pursued forbidden questions would be marginalized, how the machinery of academic consensus would enforce interpretations that served the inheritors' interests. We experience this machinery today when we try to discuss alternative history, the automatic dismissal, the appeal to authority, the ridicule of heterodox thinking. All these are products of the reset, designed to prevent exactly the kind of questioning we are engaging in now. The religious dimension of the reset deserves examination. The manuscript describes how the inheritors would use religious frameworks to recontextualize Tartarian structures, transforming technological infrastructure into sacred spaces that served spiritual rather than practical purposes. Churches and cathedrals across Europe were not built by medieval Christians, but inherited from Tartarian civilization and converted to religious use, their original energy collection function reinterpreted as divine aspiration, their precise engineering attributed to devotional dedication rather than technical knowledge. This religious reframing served multiple purposes. It explained why such sophisticated structures existed without requiring acknowledgement of the technology that had built them. It established the inheritors' religious institutions as custodians of impressive heritage, and it made the buildings sacred and therefore beyond questioning. The manuscript predicts that religious authorities would become guardians of the reset narrative, that churches would hold archives and control access to documents, that questions about building origins would be deflected by assertions of divine inspiration rather than addressed with historical evidence. This prediction has proven accurate. Religious institutions remain among the most resistant to investigation of their buildings' origins, dismissing architectural analysis as irrelevant to spiritual purpose, invoking tradition and faith to prevent the technical examination that might reveal uncomfortable truths. The manuscript's account of the reset concludes with a reflection on what would be lost and what might someday be recovered. The authors hope that documents like his would survive to guide future generations toward understanding of what had actually happened. He writes that the truth is embedded in the buildings themselves, that no amount of narrative construction can completely erase physical evidence, that future investigators would find what they needed if they knew where to look and had the courage to pursue conclusions that threatened established authority. The author expresses confidence that someday the accumulated contradictions in the reset narrative would become impossible to ignore, that evidence would surface, that researchers would connect patterns across continents and centuries, that the lie would eventually collapse under the weight of its own impossibility. He may have been describing our present moment, the age of internet communication, where researchers can compare evidence across geographic barriers, where photographs and documents can be shared instantly, where the institutional gatekeepers of knowledge are losing their ability to control what information people can access. The manuscript waited over 6 centuries for this moment. Its creator held firm conviction that suppressed knowledge would one day resurface despite all efforts at concealment. Perhaps we are the generation that will finally see what was hidden, that will understand what was lost, that will begin recovering what the reset tried to erase forever. Act 4. The Star Forts and the Grid. If the Tartarian energy system existed, physical evidence should remain, infrastructure that survived the mud flood and the reset, structures whose original purpose is visible to anyone who examines them with understanding of what they were designed to do. Star forts represent the most dramatic and undeniable evidence of the global Tartarian infrastructure, distinctive structures that appear on every inhabited continent, built to identical patterns despite supposedly being constructed by different civilizations with no contact or communication. The official explanation for star forts is military. They were designed to defend against artillery, their angled walls deflecting cannonballs, their geometric shapes providing overlapping fields of fire for defenders. Products of Renaissance military engineering that spread across the colonial world. This explanation fails basic scrutiny. Star forts appear in locations with no strategic military value, in positions that would be indefensible regardless of wall shape, in numbers far exceeding any conceivable military necessity for the territories where they were supposedly built. The manuscript identifies star forts not as military installations, but as energy collection and distribution nodes, major points in the global grid where atmospheric energy was captured, accumulated, and transmitted to surrounding areas through the network of connected structures. The distinctive star shape was not defensive but functional, the angles and proportions optimized for electromagnetic field generation, the geometry creating resonance conditions that amplified natural energy flows and enabled transmission across distances without wires or other visible connection. The manuscript provides specifications for star fort geometry, mathematical ratios that can be verified against surviving structures. And when researchers have made these comparisons, they have found remarkable consistency that supports technological rather than military purpose. The positions of star forts align along grid lines that span continents, appearing at regular intervals along specific latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates, as if placed according to a global plan that optimized energy distribution across the entire planetary surface. This positioning would be impossible if star forts were independent military constructions by different nations at different times for different purposes. The pattern only makes sense if they were built by a single civilization according to a unified design for the planetary energy grid. Modern mapping of star fort locations reveals this pattern clearly. They appear at nodes where grid lines intersect, at points where natural energy flows concentrate, at positions that optimize coverage for the surrounding territory, exactly as the manuscript describes their original function. The water features associated with star forts provide additional evidence of their energy function. Star forts are almost always positioned near significant water sources, often surrounded by moats or channels that official history explains as defensive barriers, but which may have served very different purposes. The manuscript describes water as essential to the energy transmission process, both as a medium for conducting certain frequencies and as a source of the hydrogen that atmospheric systems could separate and utilize, making water features functional rather than merely defensive components. Many star forts contain underground chambers and tunnels that official archaeology has never adequately explored or explained. Spaces that would make no sense for military purposes, but which the manuscript describes as essential infrastructure for energy processing and distribution. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of star forts consistently reveal more extensive underground structures than official accounts acknowledge. Chambers and passages that extend beyond the visible fortification, connecting to other structures in patterns that match the manuscript's descriptions of grid infrastructure. The materials used in star fort construction also suggest technological rather than military purpose. Specific types of stone and brick appear consistently. Materials with particular electromagnetic properties that would be irrelevant for defensive purposes, but essential for energy processing. The manuscript describes how star forts would be repurposed after the reset, converted to military or prison use that obscured their original function while preserving their physical structure for potential future recovery of the technology they had once supported. This prediction has proven accurate. Star forts around the world were converted to prisons, military bases, and government facilities during the 19th and 20th centuries, uses that provided justification for restricting public access while maintaining the structures in serviceable condition. Alcatraz in San Francisco Bay occupies a star fort whose military history seems disproportionate to its strategic value, but which positioned it at a key point in what the manuscript describes as the Pacific Coastal Energy Grid, connecting American facilities to those across the ocean. Fort Jefferson in the Florida Keys, Fort Pulaski in Georgia, Fort Monroe in Virginia. Installation after installation shows the same pattern. Star fort geometry at grid node positions, converted to uses that restricted access while preserving the essential infrastructure. The manuscript predicts that these conversions would eventually end, that the forts would be opened as historical monuments and tourist destinations, their true purpose concealed by interpretive frameworks that emphasized military history while ignoring the technological evidence visible in plain sight. Beyond the star forts themselves, the grid infrastructure included connecting structures that the manuscript identifies by their architectural features, buildings in cities and towns that served as local distribution nodes for energy flowing from the major collection points. These local nodes share distinctive architectural elements: spired towers, domed roofs, elaborate metalwork, precise proportions, features that appear too consistently across supposedly independent construction projects to be explained by mere stylistic fashion or coincidental parallel development. Courthouses, libraries, city halls, post offices, these civic buildings across America and Europe share the architectural DNA of Tartarian grid nodes, features that identify them as part of the energy distribution network, regardless of the purposes they supposedly serve today. The manuscript provides identification criteria. Look for buildings with copper or gold elements at their highest points. Look for spires that would serve no structural purpose. Look for domes with specific proportions. Look for underground levels that extend beyond apparent necessity. Walking through any major city with these criteria in mind reveals pattern after pattern of buildings that match, structures that official history attributes to various architects and eras, but which share features too specific and too consistent to have emerged independently. The grid connections themselves would have been invisible during normal operation. Energy flowing through atmospheric transmission and underground channels without visible infrastructure like the power lines that mark our current electrical distribution system. This invisibility made the system easy to conceal after the reset. Without visible wires to explain, the inheritors could deny the system had ever existed, could attribute buildings to purely aesthetic or institutional purposes, could claim the technology was never developed rather than actively suppressed. The manuscript notes that traces would remain for those who knew how to detect them. Electromagnetic anomalies at grid node positions, unusual properties in the soil along transmission pathways, residual effects that sensitive instruments could measure if anyone thought to look for them. Modern researchers have begun conducting these measurements, finding exactly the anomalies the manuscript predicts. Unusual electromagnetic readings at historical structures, variations in soil conductivity along apparent grid lines, evidence of systems that officially never existed. These findings are dismissed by mainstream science as coincidence or measurement error. But the consistency of the results across multiple researchers using different equipment at different locations suggests something more systematic than random variation or technical malfunction. The manuscript describes how the grid could be restored if enough of the infrastructure remained intact, if the suppressed knowledge could be recovered, if humanity reached a point where the technology would be allowed to function again, rather than being suppressed by those who benefit from energy scarcity. This restoration would not require rebuilding the entire system. Many of the original structures still stand. The atmospheric energy they were designed to collect still flows. The geometric relationships that enabled transmission remain unchanged. Only the operational knowledge has been lost or suppressed. The author expresses hope that future generations would recover this knowledge, would understand what the buildings were designed to do, would activate systems that have stood dormant for centuries, waiting for someone to understand their purpose and restore their function. Some researchers believe we are approaching this moment of restoration, that accumulated evidence is reaching critical mass, that the suppression systems are failing as information spreads through channels the inheritors cannot control, that the grid may function again within our lifetimes. Whether this optimism is justified remains to be seen. The forces that suppress the technology remain powerful. The institutions that enforce the false narrative remain influential. But the manuscript suggests that truth eventually surfaces, regardless of efforts to keep it buried. The evidence examined in this act demonstrates that the Tartarian infrastructure was not merely architectural, but functional, not merely impressive, but purposeful, not merely widespread, but systematically organized according to principles we are only beginning to recover and understand. Star forts, positioned along grid lines across every continent, connected by architectural nodes in cities and towns, powered by atmospheric energy collection from spired structures. This was a planetary system of free energy that would have made centralized control impossible and was therefore destroyed. The physical evidence remains. The buildings still stand. The geometric relationships persist. The atmospheric energy still flows. What was lost was not the infrastructure, but the knowledge. Not the hardware, but the understanding. Not the buildings, but the memory of what they were designed to do. Recovering this memory is the task of our generation, the work of those who can see past the reset narrative to the truth that physical evidence reveals. The challenge of reconstructing knowledge that powerful forces have worked for centuries to ensure would never be recovered. The orphan trains of the 19th century present a disturbing alignment with the manuscript's predictions about population replacement and the deliberate destruction of generational knowledge that might have preserved memories of the previous civilization. Official history presents the orphan trains as humanitarian efforts to relocate homeless children from overcrowded eastern cities to families in the developing West. But the scale and organization of these programs suggests something more systematic than charitable impulse. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were transported from their origins to new locations, where they were distributed to families who needed labor, separated from anyone who might have transmitted knowledge of what the world had been like before. The manuscript predicts exactly this kind of population redistribution, describing how surviving Tartarian children would be separated from communities that might preserve dangerous memories, relocated to inheritor families who would raise them in the new narrative framework. These children would grow up not knowing their true origins, would learn the history their adoptive communities taught, would become Americans or Australians, or whatever identity the inheritors assigned, losing forever any connection to what their ancestors had actually experienced. The institutions that organize these relocations, presented as charitable organizations motivated by concern for child welfare, match the manuscript's descriptions of inheritor structures that would manage the transition while concealing its true purposes from public awareness. Similar programs operated throughout the British Empire, relocating children from urban centers to colonial territories, where they would provide labor while losing connection to whatever knowledge their birth families might have preserved about the previous civilization. The Home Children Program transported over 100,000 British children to Canada, Australia, and other colonies, separating them from their origins, distributing them across vast territories, ensuring that any collective memory they might have preserved would be dispersed beyond recovery. The manuscript notes that such separations would be essential to completing the reset, that isolated individuals could not maintain knowledge that required community transmission, that scattered survivors would inevitably adopt the narratives of those who now controlled their world. We are the descendants of this process, inheritors of an identity constructed by those who erased what came before, products of educational and social systems designed to prevent us from ever asking the questions that might lead to recovery of suppressed truth. The manuscript addresses the role of wars in completing the reset, describing how conflicts would serve purposes beyond their apparent causes, destroying evidence, eliminating populations that preserved dangerous memories, justifying the consolidation of control that the inheritors required. The American Civil War, presented as a conflict over slavery and union, may have served additional purposes, the manuscript predicts: the destruction of records in the South, the displacement of populations, the establishment of federal control over territories that had maintained greater independence, the burning of Atlanta, the destruction of Columbia, the widespread devastation of Southern infrastructure eliminated not just military targets, but archives, libraries, and buildings that might have contained evidence contradicting the emerging national narrative about American origins. World War I and World War II continued this process on a global scale, destroying European archives that had preserved medieval and earlier records, eliminating populations that maintained traditional knowledge, resetting the old world as thoroughly as the new world had already been reset. The manuscript predicts that these wars would seem to emerge from political and economic causes that historians would analyze endlessly, while their deeper function as reset mechanisms would remain invisible to those trained to think within frameworks that precluded recognition of the pattern. The destruction of evidence continues in our own time, though now it takes different forms than the fires and wars of previous centuries. Urban renewal programs have demolished historical buildings, replacing evidence of the previous civilization with modern construction that reveals nothing. The manuscript predicts this continuing destruction, describing how the inheritors would find it necessary to eliminate physical evidence as awareness began to spread, to remove the buildings themselves when narratives could no longer adequately explain their anomalous features. Historic districts are rezoned for development. Heritage buildings are condemned as unsafe. Preservation efforts are underfunded while demolition proceeds. The physical evidence base shrinks with each passing decade as structures that survived the reset finally succumb to modern development pressure. Researchers studying this phenomenon have documented accelerating loss of historical architecture precisely in periods when alternative historical research began gaining public attention, suggesting coordinated response to the threat that preserved buildings posed to the official narrative. The manuscript notes that complete elimination would be impossible, that too much had been built for all of it to be destroyed, that evidence would always remain for those determined to find it, but that the destruction would make recovery increasingly difficult with each passing generation. The manuscript describes prophetic signs that would indicate when the truth was finally ready to surface, conditions that would have to be met before widespread awareness could develop, stages of awakening that would precede eventual recognition of what had been concealed. Communication technology would have to advance beyond the inheritor's ability to control it, allowing information to flow across geographic barriers, enabling researchers to compare evidence from different locations, creating networks that institutional gatekeepers could not effectively monitor. This condition has met. The Internet has created exactly the communication environment the manuscript describes, where evidence can be shared instantly, where patterns across continents can be recognized, where institutional control of information has become increasingly ineffective. Population would have to reach a critical mass of questioners, people who sensed something wrong with the official narrative, who were willing to examine evidence despite social pressure to conform, who would risk ridicule and marginalization to pursue truth wherever it led. This condition is being met. The community of alternative history researchers grows larger each year. More people question official narratives. The ridicule that once silenced inquiry increasingly seems like evidence that something is being protected rather than merely defended. The final condition the manuscript describes involves the degradation of the reset narrative itself, the accumulation of contradictions that eventually become impossible to reconcile, the moment when the lie collapses under its own weight and can no longer sustain the belief systems built upon it. We may be approaching this moment. Official history contains increasingly obvious contradictions. Evidence emerges faster than explanations can be developed. The institutional machinery that enforced consensus is losing its credibility as its bias and selectivity become impossible to ignore. The manuscript predicts this moment not as sudden revelation, but as gradual recognition, a growing awareness that spreads through populations until what was once unthinkable becomes obvious, until the old narrative seems as absurd as the truth once seemed impossible. Each person who examines the evidence and reaches their own conclusions contributes to this process. Each conversation that opens minds to possibility, each shared document or photograph or observation that plants questions. The awakening is cumulative and ultimately irreversible. The author of the manuscript expresses confidence that this moment would eventually arrive, that the truth would surface despite all efforts at suppression, that his document would find readers who would understand and who would help others understand in turn. The buildings themselves are the evidence that cannot be eliminated without destroying the cities that depend upon them. They stand as witnesses to a truth that words alone could not preserve. Physical documentation that survives regardless of what narratives are constructed around them. Walk through any major city with awareness of what the manuscript describes, and you will see evidence everywhere. The ornate facades that serve no practical modern purpose. The underground levels that make no architectural sense. The geometric patterns that repeat across structures supposedly designed by different architects. This evidence requires no special equipment to examine, no credentials to evaluate, no permission from gatekeeping institutions. The buildings are there. Their features are visible. The patterns can be recognized by anyone willing to look with eyes unclouded by assumptions taught since childhood. The manuscript was written for exactly this moment, for readers who would examine the evidence themselves, who would trust their own observations over institutional pronouncements, who would recognize that the truth has been waiting in plain sight for those ready to see it. We are those readers. This is that moment. The manuscript has found us across 6 centuries of concealment. The question now is what we will do with what we have learned. How will we share this awareness? How will we contribute to the awakening the author foresaw and hoped would someday occur? These questions demand our answer. The global nature of the evidence deserves emphasis. We have focused primarily on European and American examples, but the patterns appear on every inhabited continent, suggesting a truly planetary civilization rather than regional developments. In Australia, grand buildings in Melbourne and Sydney match the architectural DNA we have examined elsewhere. Structures that appeared with impossible speed in what official history presents as recently colonized wilderness awaiting development. In South America, The cities of Argentina and Brazil contain buildings that mirror those in Europe and North America. The same ornate facades, the same geometric proportions, the same inexplicable underground levels that make sense only as buried first floors. In Asia, beneath the narratives of ancient Eastern civilizations, buildings appear that match the global Tartarian pattern, suggesting that what we call Chinese or Indian architecture may incorporate elements from the unified civilization that preceded the current fragmented world. In Africa, archaeological sites that official history attributes to lost civilizations or colonial construction show the same architectural features, the same evidence of sophisticated engineering, the same patterns of burial and excavation we observe elsewhere. This global distribution cannot be explained by colonial spread of architectural fashion. The timeline does not work. The sophistication does not match supposed primitive conditions. The consistency across unconnected regions demands a different explanation. The manuscript provides that explanation. A single civilization spanning the globe, connected by the energy grid we have examined, building according to standardized specifications that produced the consistency we observe, regardless of location. The fragmentation of this unified world into the nation-states we know today was part of the reset process, dividing populations that had been connected, establishing competing identities that prevented recognition of common heritage, ensuring the truth would be lost in nationalist narratives. Every nation now claims its historical buildings as products of its own national genius, its own cultural development, its own architectural traditions, when the evidence suggests they all inherited structures from a civilization that preceded and encompassed them all. The manuscript predicts this fragmentation, describing how the inheritors would divide the world to prevent unified recognition of what had existed before, how nationalism would become a tool of concealment, how pride in supposed national achievements would blind populations to their common heritage. The timeline contradictions deserve careful attention. Official history compresses remarkable achievements into impossibly short periods, claiming that cities emerged from wilderness in decades, that architectural sophistication developed without apparent precedent. San Francisco supposedly grew from small settlement to major metropolis in the span of 50 years, complete with elaborate Victorian architecture that would require generations to develop and decades to construct, even with modern equipment and unlimited resources. The same pattern appears in Denver, Seattle, Portland, city after city emerging fully formed as if conjured from nothing, their magnificent buildings attributed to recent construction, when the evidence suggests they pre-existed their supposed founding dates. The manuscript explains these timeline impossibilities. The cities were already there, buried or partially buried, waiting to be excavated and claimed, their existence predating the arrival of those who would write the history, attributing everything to themselves. Once you recognize this pattern, official history becomes a collection of absurdities, impossible achievements attributed to populations that lack the resources, the technology, and the time to accomplish what they supposedly created from nothing. The disappearance of the technology raises questions the manuscript addresses directly. If such advanced capabilities existed, why do they no longer function? Why can we not simply restore what was lost? Why does the knowledge remain suppressed even now? The author describes the technology as requiring the intact grid to function, individual components unable to operate in isolation, The system designed as integrated whole, where each part depended on connection to all other parts for proper operation. When the grid failed during the mud flood events, everything connected to it failed simultaneously. Local nodes could not function without connection to the network. The technology did not degrade gradually, but collapsed entirely when the system lost coherence. Restoration would require not just understanding individual components, but rebuilding the entire network simultaneously. A project beyond the capability of inheritor civilizations that never understood how the system worked and have actively suppressed those who attempted recovery. The manuscript suggests this suppression was deliberate from the beginning, that inheritors understood enough to recognize the threat free energy posed to their control, that they systematically eliminated not just the technology, but the knowledge that might enable its reconstruction. The question of deliberate sabotage haunts the manuscript's account. Did the grid fail naturally, or was it attacked? Did the mud flood result from system degradation or deliberate destruction? Were the inheritors merely opportunists or active participants in the catastrophe? The author hints at darker possibilities without stating them directly, describing forces that worked against Tartarian civilization, interests that would benefit from its collapse, preparations that suggested advanced knowledge of what was coming. If the catastrophe was engineered, the reset takes on even more sinister dimensions, not merely opportunistic inheritance, but deliberate destruction of a civilization that stood in the way of those who now control our world and our understanding of history. This possibility cannot be proven from the manuscript alone, but it aligns with patterns of suppression that seem too systematic, too thorough, too successful to have emerged from mere opportunism without coordination and advanced planning. The truth may be lost forever, buried with the civilization itself. But the possibility should inform our understanding of what we face, not merely ignorance to be corrected, but active suppression by forces that understand exactly what they are hiding and why. The manuscript addresses the question of what survivors of the mud flood actually experienced. The trauma of watching their world collapse, the challenges of adapting to conditions utterly different from what they had known before the catastrophe. Those who survived the initial events found themselves in a transformed landscape. Familiar structures buried or destroyed, communication networks severed, the grid that had powered their civilization gone forever, unable to be restored without knowledge and resources now lost. They would have known what had been lost in ways that inheritor populations could not understand, would have mourned a civilization that their children would never know, would have watched as newcomers claimed the ruins of their world and rewrote history to exclude their memory. The manuscript describes this survivor experience with compassion, acknowledging the suffering of those who lived through the transition, honoring their memory even as it documented the erasure of everything they had known and built and loved before the catastrophe. We may be descendants of both survivors and inheritors, bloodlines merged across generations until the distinction lost meaning. All of us now products of the reset, regardless of our genetic heritage. All of us taught the false history that concealed what our ancestors had experienced. The psychological dimensions of the reset deserve attention. How did populations accept narratives that contradicted what they could see with their own eyes? How did obvious evidence fail to prevent the false history from becoming accepted truth? The manuscript describes processes we would now call cognitive dissonance and social conformity, The tendency of humans to accept what authorities tell them, even when evidence contradicts. The pressure to conform that punishes those who question established narratives. Survivors who spoke of the previous civilization would have been dismissed as confused, as mentally ill, as dangerous. Their accounts would have been pathologized and marginalized. Within a generation, no one would have been willing to voice what had become forbidden knowledge. Children raised in the new narrative would have no framework for understanding what older people remembered. The gap between generations would have been unbridgeable. The reset would complete itself naturally once those with living memory died and their accounts died with them. We experience the results of this psychological process today. Even when presented with evidence, most people cannot accept conclusions that contradict what they have been taught since childhood. The conditioning runs too deep. The discomfort is too great. The social cost of questioning is too high. The role of photography in the reset is paradoxical. The camera arrived at exactly the moment when documentation could have preserved evidence of the previous civilization. Yet, photographs have been used primarily to support the false narrative, rather than expose it. Early photographs show buildings in states that contradict official construction timelines. Workers posed with completed structures they supposedly built. Excavation activity presented as construction. Evidence of prior existence disguised as current development. These photographs have been preserved in archives where researchers can examine them. The evidence of the reset, hidden in plain sight, within the visual record that was supposed to document progress, but actually documented inheritance and concealment. The manuscript predicts this paradox, noting that evidence would survive within the systems designed to support the false narrative, that truth would hide inside the lie, that future investigators would find what they needed if they knew how to look at what had been preserved. We have these photographs now. We can examine them with awareness of what the manuscript describes. We can see the evidence that previous generations could not recognize because they lacked the framework that would make the anomalies visible and significant. Conclusion. What does this mean for our future? We have examined the manuscript and the physical evidence that corresponds to its claims. We have traced a narrative very different from official history. If the manuscript is accurate, we live among the ruins of a civilization far more advanced than our own, inheritors of structures we did not build and cannot replicate, beneficiaries of an inheritance whose true value we are only beginning to understand after centuries of deliberate forgetting. The energy systems described in the manuscript, if they could be restored, would transform human civilization entirely, eliminating the scarcity that drives conflict, freeing populations from dependence on centralized systems, enabling the kind of freedom that made the previous civilization possible. This is why the technology was suppressed, why the knowledge was erased, why the narrative was constructed. Free energy means free people. Those who control energy control populations. The inheritors understood this and acted accordingly to maintain their position. The question for our generation is whether we will accept this control or work to recover what was taken. Whether we will remain within the narrative constructed to contain us, or begin the process of reconstruction that might someday restore what was lost. The manuscript offers no simple answers. It does not provide blueprints for reconstructing the technology. It does not name those responsible for the reset. It does not promise that recovery is possible or that the inheritors will allow it to occur without resistance. What it offers instead is a framework for understanding, a lens through which evidence becomes visible, a narrative that resolves contradictions the official history cannot explain, an alternative that at least deserves consideration when the mainstream account leaves so much unexplained. Each person must evaluate this evidence individually. No authority can tell you what to believe. The buildings exist. The photographs exist. The patterns can be observed. The contradictions in official history are documented. The conclusion you draw is yours alone to reach. What we can say with certainty is that the official narrative is incomplete at best and deliberately deceptive at worst. Buildings exist that should not exist according to official timelines. Evidence has been systematically suppressed. Questions have been forbidden rather than answered. This alone should concern anyone who values truth over comfort, who prefers difficult questions to easy answers, who recognizes that institutional authority is not the same as accuracy, and that consensus is not the same as correctness. The manuscript suggests that we stand at a turning point, that the centuries of suppression may be ending, that the truth is surfacing through channels that can no longer be controlled, that our generation may see the beginning of recovery that the author hoped would someday occur. Whether this optimism is justified depends in part on what we do with this awareness. Knowledge that remains private changes nothing. Understanding that is not shared cannot contribute to the collective awakening that reconstruction would require. The author wrote his manuscript to preserve truth across centuries of concealment. He succeeded. The document survived. The information has reached us. Now the question is whether we will do our part, whether we will share what we have learned, whether we will continue the work he began. This is not a call for confrontation with institutions that remain powerful and determined to maintain their narrative. It is an invitation to conversation, to examination, to the kind of gentle questioning that opens minds without triggering the defensive reactions that confrontation provokes. Share what you have learned with those who seem receptive. Point out the anomalies in your own city. Ask questions that official histories cannot answer. Plant seeds that may take years to germinate, but that will eventually produce the harvest the manuscript describes. The buildings will remain, whether we recognize their true nature or not. The structures persist, regardless of what narratives we construct around them. Physical evidence outlasts any interpretation. The truth will surface eventually, whether we contribute to its emergence or not. The only question is how long the process takes and how much more evidence is lost before recognition finally occurs. The manuscript waited 6 centuries for readers who would understand. It found us. We are the generation that received this inheritance of awareness, this responsibility to continue what the author began, this opportunity to contribute to the awakening he foresaw. What will we do with this opportunity? Will we accept the comfortable narrative we were given, or will we pursue the uncomfortable truth that evidence suggests? Will we remain silent, or will we speak? Will we pass on what we have learned, or will we let it die with us? These are questions each person must answer individually. No one can decide for you what to believe or what to do. The evidence has been presented. The alternative framework has been explained. The choice of how to respond is entirely yours. The 1357 manuscript closes with words that have resonated across 6 centuries of concealment, words that seem written directly for this moment, for us, for readers who would finally be ready to hear what the author needed to say. He writes that truth is patient, that it waits for those ready to receive it, that no amount of suppression can ultimately prevent what must eventually be known, that the lie carries the seeds of its own destruction, regardless of how carefully it is maintained. He expresses faith in future generations, belief that humanity would eventually mature enough to handle the truth, confidence that the awakening would occur even if he could not know when or how or through whom the process would begin. We may be the fulfillment of that faith. We may be the generation he wrote for. We may be the ones who finally see what was hidden and begin the work of recovery that centuries of suppression delayed, but could not ultimately prevent. The manuscript ends with a blessing for those who would read it, a hope that they would find the courage to pursue truth regardless of cost, a prayer that the knowledge preserved would serve the recovery the author knew might take generations to achieve. Let us honor that hope by doing what we can with what we have learned. Let us share this awareness with those ready to receive it. Let us examine the evidence in our own cities and communities. Let us ask the questions that institutions prefer we not ask. Let us be worthy of the faith the author placed in future readers, worthy of the effort that preserved this manuscript across centuries, worthy of the truth that has finally reached us after waiting so long for those who would understand and act upon its message. The buildings stand as silent witnesses. The evidence remains visible for those with eyes to see. The truth waits to be recognized. The awakening continues. And we, having heard this account, are now part of the process, whether we choose to be or not. What was erased can be recovered. What was forgotten can be remembered. What was suppressed can be restored. The 1357 manuscript tells us this is possible. The question is whether we will contribute to making it happen, or merely observe as history continues without our participation. This has been the 1357 manuscript, proof they tried to erase ancient Tartaria from history. The evidence has been presented. The alternative has been explained. The choice of what to do next is yours. May you choose wisely. May truth guide your path. May the awakening continue through your efforts. The question of what we should do with this knowledge requires careful consideration. Revolutionary action based on alternative historical theories could be counterproductive, generating backlash that strengthens the institutions we seek to question. The manuscript counsels patience and persistence rather than confrontation, the gradual accumulation of awareness rather than dramatic attempts to force recognition. Trust in the process of truth emerging naturally when conditions are ready. This does not mean passive acceptance. It means strategic engagement, choosing battles that can be won, building communities of awareness that can support each other, creating resources that will help others who are ready to question what they were taught. The Internet has created unprecedented opportunity for this kind of distributed awakening. Information flows through channels that institutional gatekeepers cannot control. Communities form around shared questioning. The monopoly on historical narrative is breaking. But the Internet also creates dangers. Disinformation can spread as easily as truth. Sensationalism can discredit legitimate inquiry. The inheritors have adapted to the new environment, flooding alternative channels with material designed to make all questioning seem absurd. Discernment becomes essential. Not every alternative theory deserves equal consideration. Evidence matters. Logical consistency matters. The manuscript itself emphasizes rigorous examination over credulous acceptance, testing claims against observable reality. The buildings are the foundation of our evidence because they can be examined directly, without reliance on documents that might be forged or sources that might be fabricated. The physical evidence is primary. Everything else must be evaluated against what the buildings reveal. This is why we have focused so heavily on architectural evidence throughout this investigation. The buildings cannot be denied. They exist. Their features can be measured. Their anomalies can be documented. No authority can prevent you from looking at a building and asking questions about what you see. Start with the buildings in your own community. Look for the features the manuscript describes. Document what you find. Share your observations with others who are asking similar questions. Build the evidentiary foundation that will eventually make denial impossible. The awakening happens one person at a time, one building at a time, one conversation at a time. There is no shortcut. There is no dramatic revelation that will convince everyone simultaneously. There is only the patient work of accumulating evidence and sharing awareness. The manuscript describes a future moment when accumulated evidence reaches critical mass, when denial becomes harder than acceptance, when the official narrative collapses not through attack, but through the weight of its own contradictions. We may be approaching that moment, or it may still be generations away. The manuscript does not specify timing, only that the truth will eventually surface, because truth has a persistence that lies cannot ultimately match, regardless of how carefully they are maintained. The author wrote for an audience he could not know, trusting that his words would find readers who would understand, who would continue the work he began, who would carry the message forward until the awakening he foresaw finally occurred. We are those readers. We have received his message. The question of what we do next is not answered in the manuscript. It is answered by our choices, our actions, our willingness to participate in the process he described and hoped for. The buildings wait for recognition. The evidence waits for examination. The truth waits for those willing to pursue it regardless of difficulty. The manuscript has delivered its message. Now we must decide what that message means for how we live. Consider what it would mean if the manuscript's account is accurate. We inhabit the ruins of a civilization far more advanced than our own. We have been systematically deceived about our past. We possess potential we have been trained to deny. This is not merely intellectual curiosity about historical accuracy. This is existential questioning about who we are, what we are capable of, and what forces have shaped our understanding of ourselves in ways that limit our potential. The suppression of free energy technology alone has implications that extend far beyond historical interest. If such technology existed and was deliberately suppressed, we have been forced into artificial scarcity that has caused immeasurable suffering and enabled immeasurable control. Wars have been fought over energy resources that might be unnecessary. Populations have been impoverished by energy costs that might be eliminated. The environment has been damaged by extraction and combustion that might be avoided entirely. The manuscript suggests this suffering was not inevitable, but was imposed by those who understood that free energy would mean free people, that abundance would undermine the control structures that depend on scarcity for their power over populations. This is why the reset was necessary. This is why the knowledge was suppressed. This is why the narrative was constructed. Not merely to claim credit for buildings someone else built, but to maintain the conditions of artificial scarcity that enable domination. Understanding this transforms our relationship to the evidence. We are not merely pursuing historical accuracy. We are recovering knowledge that was suppressed specifically to maintain our current condition. The stakes extend far beyond academic disputes about the past. The manuscript may be the key to understanding not just what was, but what could be, not just what we lost, but what we might recover, not just historical truth, but present possibility and future potential that has been systematically denied to us. This is the ultimate significance of what we have examined tonight. The 1357 manuscript is not merely a historical document about the past. It is a message about our present condition and a guide to possibilities that the reset was designed to ensure we would never recognize. The author wrote knowing this. He understood that his message would matter not just for historical accuracy, but for the liberation of future generations from conditions of artificial limitation that were being imposed as his world was being destroyed. The manuscript represents a different kind of inheritance, not buildings or technology, but understanding. Not physical artifacts, but the knowledge that makes those artifacts comprehensible and potentially recoverable. Each generation that receives this understanding and passes it forward contributes to the eventual restoration the author foresaw. Each person who awakens from the reset narrative weakens the control that suppression maintains. We cannot know when critical mass will be reached, when awareness will spread beyond the ability of institutions to contain, when the official narrative will collapse under accumulated contradiction. But we can know that we are part of that process. The manuscript promised that truth would eventually surface. That promise begins its fulfillment each time someone examines the evidence and reaches their own conclusions. That promise is fulfilled through us, through our choices, through our willingness to see and to share. Let the buildings speak to you. Let the evidence guide your conclusions. Let the truth emerge through your own examination rather than through acceptance of what authorities have declared. The awakening is individual before it becomes collective. What we have examined tonight changes nothing if it remains merely intellectual entertainment. Interesting ideas to consider and then set aside as we return to normal assumptions about history and possibility. What we have examined tonight changes everything if it becomes the foundation for ongoing inquiry, the beginning of personal investigation, the catalyst for conversations that spread awareness to others who are ready to question. The choice between these outcomes is yours. The manuscript has delivered its message. The evidence has been presented. The alternative framework has been explained. What happens next depends entirely on what you decide to do with what you have learned. The author trusted that his words would find readers who would understand and who would act on that understanding. He could not know who those readers would be, or when they would receive his message. He wrote in faith that the truth would matter to someone. We have the opportunity to justify that faith, to demonstrate that the centuries of preservation were worthwhile, to show that the suppression ultimately failed because human beings will always seek truth, regardless of how inconvenient that seeking becomes. The physical evidence we have examined exists in your world, not just in distant cities described in documentaries. Look at the buildings in your own community with new eyes. You may be surprised what you discover. Municipal buildings, libraries, old banks and courthouses. These structures often contain the architectural signatures we have described, the features that identify Tartarian grid nodes, regardless of their current function or claimed construction date. Photograph what you find. Measure the proportions. Research the official construction dates and ask whether they make sense given the sophistication of what you observe. Document the anomalies that official history cannot explain. Connect with others who are conducting similar investigations. Share your findings. Build the evidentiary database that will eventually make the truth undeniable. Contribute to the awakening through your own direct participation. Remember that the author of this manuscript wrote in hope, not despair. He believed humanity would eventually awaken. He trusted that the truth would find its way to those who needed to hear it. That trust was not misplaced. Thank you for joining this investigation into hidden history. Thank you for the courage to examine evidence that challenges comfortable assumptions. Thank you for the willingness to question what you were taught and consider what might actually be true. The manuscript will be waiting for those who come after us, as it waited for us, as it waited for centuries, patient and persistent and ultimately triumphant over all efforts to ensure it would never be read and understood. Share what you have learned. Ask questions that deserve answers. Examine the evidence in your own world. Contribute to the awakening that the author foresaw, and that may finally be beginning in our time, in our generation, through our efforts and our courage. The truth is patient, but truth revealed through those who speak it travels faster than truth that must wait to be discovered. Be part of that acceleration. Be part of the recovery. Be part of the future the manuscript hoped would someday arrive. The 1357 manuscript has delivered its message across 6 centuries of suppression. Now that message lives in you. What happens next depends on what you do with what you have learned. May you act wisely. May truth prevail. May the hidden history finally become known.